This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. It's been a dry spell for rating and reviewing, so I'm going to ask again. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store, rate the podcast on Spotify, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Arlene continues to do an amazing job as community manager for our Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group. Please consider joining at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. A quick note about social media. I'm actually slightly more active on Twitter than anywhere else, and as you may have heard in the news, there is some craziness happening at Twitter these days. A number of people have moved to a new platform called Mastodon. It is, I'll be honest, slightly more difficult to get the hang of, but if you're interested in that kind of thing, I am at Graceful Atheist at mas.to. I'll have the link in the show notes. I don't know what's going to happen to Twitter over the next year, but if it does come crashing down, which is at least a small possibility, I will be on Mastodon. I also wanted to acknowledge that on Instagram and Facebook, Ray, former guest of the show, has been doing beautiful memes of quotes from guests on the show, so you can find them there as well. I tend to lurk on Facebook because of the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group. I'm there. And then finally, I do in fact have a YouTube channel that is way out of date. Community member has talked about possibly participating in progressing that forward, so hopefully that will soon be up to date. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guests today are Nathan Alexander and Todd Tavares, and they are the co-hosts of Beyond Atheism. I love what they're doing over there at the podcast. It is a sister or cousin podcast to this one. They are asking the question, we're atheists, now what? What do we do beyond atheism? So this was a really fun conversation. We have so much in common. I really appreciate the work that Nathan and Todd are doing. Here are Nathan and Todd to tell their stories. I have with me Nathan Alexander and Todd Tavares. Gentlemen, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Great to be here, David.
Thanks for having us.
So Evan Clark, who is of the Atheist United group, got us in touch with each other. I'm very excited about this. You guys have a podcast called Beyond Atheism that I would say is, if not a sister podcast, a cousin podcast to this one. I think you guys are covering a lot of very similar territory, so we'll jump into that momentarily. But the question we ask everyone on the podcast is what their religious tradition was like growing up. So we'll have both of you answer that question, and let's begin with Todd.
Oh, all right. I was raised Catholic. And I mean, technically, since I was confirmed, I still am. So if anyone ever presses me on it, I can say I am Catholic. They haven't excommunicated me yet. So
okay. All right.
And I don't know where to begin with this, because it's not that it was like a super intense part of my upbringing. Although I think I'm different from you guys, at least in the sense that like it wasn't that strong for me. I never had, I was never like fervently Catholic. I was never deeply religious. I remember being young and skeptical. Like I remember the going along with it thing. And I remember like developing that skepticism quite early and comparing it to things like Santa Claus. Because as a kid, I don't know, I was kind of bratty in some ways. I remember every year trying to catch the Easter Bunny. I set up a net one year. I slept under the Christmas tree so I could catch Santa Claus. So there was always that part of like, experimenting with the world and testing and trying things. And like that, at a certain point with God, I just got to the point where like, there are pictures of UFOs. People see UFOs. Mm-hmm. People have seen Bigfoot. This seems to be without that.
Well, Todd, it sounds like you were an empiricist from a very young age.
Yeah, I do. I remember being told like toys move around at night and then like setting them up very strategically and measuring it the morning after. but yeah, so like I mean, it was a very weak faith, and it was imbued with a lot of skepticism. And what really mattered for like the religious upbringing to me was that it was a source of conflict, right, in my family. It's like this is not something I believe. It's not something I want in my life. Um, and there were very early signs that I strongly disagreed with it and was being coerced into it. And so I'll give you there are two things that I'd kind of like to highlight about it. Um, One was I remember being quite young, maybe like 12 or so, and being brought to um, an Ash Wednesday mass in the basement of the cathedral where there was a shrine, and they had like crutches everywhere where people who had been cured
Hmm.
left their crutches, right? Because now they can walk. It's amazing. It's a miracle. Um, and I went with my mother, and my mother was deeply Catholic. She was very strongly Catholic. She taught catechism. She would sometimes invite the priest over to have dinner. We would bring the sacraments up occasionally at Mass, things like that. So she was sitting in the front, made me sit right in the front. And I remember the priest comes out, and the opening thing was like, "You're all sinners. Everything,
Hmm.
it's like, we're here to atone because you're sinners. You've been offending God for the whole year." It's this litany list of how terrible we are. And this voices started coming out from the back of the room, people saying like, "You can't call me that, I'm no sinner."
Interesting.
And like, yeah, and I mean that really, I remember that really stands out as an important memory, where my mother was sitting there nodding along with the priest, going along with this guilt trip, which, I mean, it's Catholic guilt, it sticks around forever, you never ever shake it off, right, about
Yeah.
anything. um And meanwhile, like hearing other voices that said, like, no, we're not sinners. We're not bad people. We're not terrible.
Right.
That, I think that was the kind of thing that shook me out of just going along, being like, I don't need to. Other people feel this way. It's a normal thing. It's okay to say no when you disagree. Right. And
Right.
it's such a rare thing. The only other times I would see things like that is my father wouldn't take communion. And I mean,
Hmm.
if for people listening, you know, if you're on the verge or you're still going, attending or whatever, like going up and joining this line and taking the communion and turning around and seeing an empty church with one person sitting there, it's a very powerful signal. It's pretty impressive. So, and of course, it's like, well, now I know I've kind of got an ally. Um, And then in the, I think, gosh, I guess it would have been the late '90s by then. Yeah, it was sometime in the late '90s. There was a Catholic sex scandal, if you can imagine such a thing.
Say it isn't
Um,
so.
but yeah, well, the really crazy thing about this is that the conspiracy of silence around it,
Hmm.
like people just didn't address it. It was really ridiculous. I mean, by then had already made up my mind. I had to go through confirmation as part of, family negotiation, stuff that you just have to do.
Hmm.
And
'Cause you're still very young at this age, yeah?
yeah, so I would have been, I mean, like, it definitely happened by the time I was confirmed. So I'm from a town, Fall River, Massachusetts. So this is right before the Boston one, maybe like, about 10 years before, 5 to
Okay.
10 years. Um, But what was really shocking about it is people who were really Catholic, really supported the church, just never mentioned it. There were never any apologies. There were never like, and that really turned me off to the whole mindset. I think it's like you can't. At what point do you? Like, it's children, and you're going to defend this institution?
That would be a powerful motivator, I would think.
Yeah, yeah, it
Yeah,
was it
yeah.
was a thing that's like, it's okay. There's a time to run, not
Mhm.
walk, and this is a signal. So yeah, I mean, I was raised with this sort of the I don't know. Is it, well, I'll just say it. You guys can tell me if I'm way off base on this one. Sort of like the naive faith of a child, right? Well, everybody says there's a God. Everybody says there's a
Sure.
Santa. There must be, and went along with it until it was like, I don't see it, right? Like how many times? the thing that the nuns will teach you, and they teach you at Sunday school, is God answers every prayer, but the answer is usually no.
Mm.
And well, the answer is always but yeah, if there's always not an answer, there's no one answering, and that's so I was pushed down that road very early. And in my, I want to say I was about 10 by the time I started actively not believing and
Okay.
moving past that.
See, that's amazing to me. The ripe old age of 10, like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, that's really impressive, actually.
Well, I think we all kind of end up in these. To me, there seem to be about like three doors, and I guess you would, David, you would know this better than me. But it seems the people I interact with, we either end up kind of either like very religious, and then we
Hmm.
have to make this dramatic move away from it, or kind of like me, where it's a little bit softer. You're raised in it; it's a tradition, and you move away from it. It dies away. You're
Hmm.
never really that committed to it. Where people are raised without religion.
Right.
These seem to be the three avenues that people go down. I guess it's just it's a continuum, and we kind of slot it this way.
Yeah, for sure. I see just an entire spectrum of people's experiences, both coming into and leaving religion. And
Mm,
but one of the things that is a relatively common theme is very young people having like a moral stance against
mm.
what they're being taught, so that a child's sense of morality says this isn't right, and then they begin that process of leaving or very very early.
Totally, totally. And like, I mean, a big part of it is like, I didn't like being lied to. I don't think
Yeah.
anybody likes that. And once you get to the point where it's like, okay, like the thing that makes sense is people made this up. They're just telling these stories. And I don't want to be told that these stories need to dictate my life anymore. I want to go out and explore and find out what's real and see what that means. So yeah, it really, I think, like in terms of personality, it was just really rubbed me the wrong way. The downside is like it leads to a lot of conflict. I lived right down the
Mhm.
street from the church. I remember
Okay.
like waking up to church bells. We could hear it from where we lived. And one morning, my mother heard it, and then we started this like slow motion fight. It's pretty amazing. Where like she was trying to get me to go to church without saying you're going to church. It's like, oh, let's go for a walk. Oh, dress up nice. Isn't that? And what? And eventually, right before that was like at 9 o'clock, and by 11 o'clock, it was get in the car. And it was. I mean, it's only like quarter mile up the road, and I think I threatened to jump out of the car, and that's really what it took.
I'm willing to get out of a moving car rather than go to
Yeah,
church.
yeah, yeah. Oh
Okay.
yeah, it did not agree with me at all. But technically, I'm still a confirmed Catholic, so there you go. I think it's different for Nathan.
Well, I think my experience is a bit different than Todd's, just because, well, I was raised Anglican, um, and I
Mhm.
never really had a seriously negative view of religion growing up. I mean, I think I didn't like going to church. I mean, but more because it's just boring when you're a kid. It's just you
Mhm.
just don't want
Yeah.
to get dressed up.
Mhm.
You don't want to go. You don't want to just sit there. It's like when there's a whole bunch of old people there and stuff, and you really don't like it. But I never had, so I didn't dislike it on like metaphysical grounds or anything like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so you know, I I went to church growing up and stuff, but I sort of stopped when I was a teenager. But I still would have, called myself a Christian and still believed in God and stuff like that. Um, and I think it was my early 20s that I kind of was becoming more and more sort of skeptical, and eventually became an atheist. I mean, it's also different too, because I really kind of wanted there to be a God. Like I wanted it
Hmm.
to be true,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it's a comfort that with the idea that there's some ultimate plan for you, and like you don't have to worry because things are going to work out for you. Um, and so on. There's a purpose to life and a meaning and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I didn't have like a sort of a negative break where I was leaving a church community or something because I didn't go to church. And there wasn't very much conflict except for sort of internally.
Yeah.
And even that wasn't too dramatic really in the end. I mean, I think once maybe this is sort of common. It's like once I sort of took that leap or whatever, to atheism, then you realize like it's not actually a leap at all, and
Yeah.
there's nothing to you know to be worried. Like life still has meaning after all, and so on. At least
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, so I think it's sort of interesting, because my own religious experience was not strongly negative or anything like that, and yet I've sort of wound up doing this atheist podcast and being involved in atheist stuff in other respects.
Did you have a moment, Nathan? So it sounds like Todd, at 10 years old was like, this is just Santa Claus level of true. Did you have a moment where you were like, I don't think this is true anymore?
Yeah, I think, like in my early 20s. And I think it's sort of like a gradual process where
Sure.
I think early, at some point, maybe in my teens or something, I found it, like the idea that the Bible wasn't literally true. That was kind of, if everything in the Bible isn't true, then how is it possible that just some of it is true? But I
Right.
think you sort of reconcile yourself to that. But yeah, I think in my early 20s, I would say there was a point when you sort of like, you kind of strip away more and more, then it becomes a sort of generic kind of like theism or whatever that,
Mm-hmm.
and then that finally goes as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the funny thing is, like, I remember watching a debate with like a Christian and Richard Dawkins, and by this point, I was sort of still like hoping the Christian was going to sort of triumph and give a good argument for God, and I really found the argument like pretty poor, obviously. So yeah,
I think that's still my experience. Every once in a while, I'll listen to an apologist and I'll think, I hope they have like some point to make.
yeah.
No, they don't.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
quite disappointing. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's also because you sort of assume like, there's this idea like, okay, I don't have good reasons for believing, but other people probably do.
Right.
And like, and I can sort of, like they sort of prop up my faith because other people really strongly believe this, and therefore, if they do, there must be something to it, and yeah, and that sort of helps you as well.
I think you just described a lot of my faith lasting longer than it needed to. Was I thought somebody smarter than me understands this somewhere else, and I can just pass that off to them. And yeah, and then when I started to actually look at it myself, the house of cards starts to fall down. So
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Nathan, you provided us with a really good segue of now you do this podcast that's all about atheism. So first, I want to hear the story about how the two of you met, because you met in South Korea, correct?
Yeah.
And so I'd like to hear, how'd you both end up there? How'd you meet each other, and how did you wind up deciding to do a podcast with one another?
Oof. I'm not even sure where to begin with that. How far back do you need us to go, David? How we ended up in Korea? I think we were both teaching there, and we ended up through mutual friends on the same trivia team, Don
okay.
Quixote, and man, we were a hell of a team. We kicked
Okay.
some ass. One of the problems was that you could win free beer, and we won free beer quite often. It was a weekday, so we'd stay up late drinking way too much beer.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
We were also, Nathan, you were in an atheist group there, right?
Yeah. It was basically when I went to Korea, it was after my master's. I did my master's, and I wasn't sure what to do next really. So I wound up in Korea. And so this was at the same time as I was kind of, becoming an atheist, and I was kind of seeking out a community of atheists. And there was an atheist group I found in South Korea, It was mostly expats, as I remember. But anyway, like eventually, in a roundabout way, I met Todd through that.
Yeah.
Okay.
We
But
may have been members of the same group, and
it's possible.
we
Yes,
just
yes.
missed each other, but we never met there, oddly enough.
No, no.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it was a strange group, because if it was the same one, I was a member of Rational Thinkers first, and that was a little strange because it included religious people. It was open for religious people, anyone who's rational. Like there are people who identify as irrational. Um, that was a little strange.
Yeah.
It was also one of the other things that was weird about it is, like, that continuum of atheists. It was a lot of people who never had any religion.
Okay.
So, and that's a very, very different dynamic. Um, and one of the things that I saw, not a lot, but you'd run into it, is people who ended up, they ended up in a foreign country because they were so cut off from their family. Like they
Yeah.
literally had nowhere to go. They lost their family, they lost their friends, they can't get work. This is where they end up. People who were often from the South. I knew someone who was training to become a pastor and had to, I think he's in Japan now.
Hmm.
Really tough stuff. And one of the unfortunate things is that with a group like this that's not attuned to that need, we would, it wasn't a very welcoming environment. And that,
Right.
it's heartbreaking. It wasn't at all what I wanted to be part of. Like, why are we more welcoming to church people than we are to people who have serious needs? I knew a guy from Pakistan who got run out of the country with death threats. It's like,
Yeah.
we need to take this seriously. So we ended up, me and some other people kind of reformed, made a different group that was just atheist and was more centered on this idea of, like, kind of like the Beyond Atheism thing. Instead of sitting around and talking about technology and transhumanism and how silly religions are, let's kind of address what we need as the people that we are. And it's and one of the things that the podcast has discovered too is, like, yeah, this happens all the time. And, like, people are always making these groups, and sometimes they have a short shelf life. Sometimes they last a long time. They're always reconstituting themselves. So that's part of the background of what led to, or like what led to the aim of Beyond Atheism.
Okay.
Right? Like, we've done enough of this. Yes, religion is silly. We don't need to have these arguments about the proof of God. What we need to do is think more about, like, what it is that we need, what it is that we want, what is the world that we're trying to make, and how do we make it. And fortunately, that's where we ended up with the podcast now. Nathan very wisely, as when we started, pointed out, like, let's never talk about what religion is up to. Let's never think about that. And that, I think, has been, like, the best thing to happen for us, for the podcast, is never needing to worry about that, because it's irrelevant to what we're doing.
Yeah, I'll just comment here. Like, when I started my podcast, I saw the same thing. I saw so many people doing response podcasts and YouTube videos, and they're always responding to the religious argument, and they're playing on their turf. And I think all of us had the same impetus of, like, yeah, but now what, right? Like, now what do I do with my life? Like, that's what I care about, and trying to move beyond that. So I think that's really really interesting.
Yeah, it feels like it's kind of like where, like, the next generation of things, right? Like, it's been about 20 years since we had the New Atheists, right? And that moment did what it did, right? It broke atheism, it made it mainstream, became okay to talk about. And the numbers, anytime there's a Pew report or any sort of religious survey that comes out, you see the results. Atheism, nuns keep growing and growing and growing.
Yeah.
You don't need to replay these battles again. It's okay to take the next step. And I think that, David, that's definitely where you are. It's where we're trying to be.
Yeah.
I do feel like there is still a place, I think, for the sort of people who are kind of still debating Christians and so on. Because we we need to keep our supply of atheists fresh and keep converting new people. But
I seem to have an infinite supply almost, but yeah,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
but I guess I think everyone, when I became an atheist, like I was, watching. I really liked watching all these videos of like
Mhm.
Christian destroyed by atheist or
Yeah.
whatever.
Mm.
But obviously you get past that. But I think everyone, maybe, like, there's still a place for that depending on where people are in their sort of their journey, so to speak. So I don't. Yeah. So I think um, I guess I'm glad people are still doing that. Although I think it's not what me and Todd are really interested in doing.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the language or the nomenclature. I saw you guys kind of in the podcast, in your writing, struggle through some of the same things that I have, that in that atheist has such a negative connotation in society. It's
Mm.
seen as an aggressive stance when I think most of us would say we're agnostic atheists or weak atheists or whatever terminology you want to
Mm.
use. I know for a while, like just prior to my deconversion in 2015, there was some discussion of things like atheism plus.
Mm.
I really landed on humanism kind of encompassed what I was interested in, right? Like a secular outlook, a scientific outlook, and caring for people. And that last bit
Mm.
was really critical, that this is what I actually do believe in is people. So I'm
Mm.
curious how you've worked through some of those language issues for yourselves. What do you call yourselves? And what is it like that the podcast represents for you?
Mm. Well, David, I'm shocked that you're still on the weak side of the spectrum.
I mean, in the sense of you can't prove a negative, and
Yeah.
yeah, and what might not be knowable, but yes,
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, like, even now, I'm vastly between, some form of agnosticism, right? Like, it's unknowable. There's like
yeah,
just we know that what the claims that are religious claims that are made, we know that they're false. But there's stuff that we just can't know. But you're right. In this, it's really really difficult. It's loaded. One of the things that we like to use are sort of like big A atheists and small A atheists,
hmm
where, like, yeah, if you identify as an atheist and that's your position, it's a strong position. It's pretty definitive and clear. But plenty of people go out and live their life as if there is no God, right?
hmm
As if all religion is not true, as if there are no gods and goddesses. And if you live that way, you are atheist, right? So that's
hmm
like the small a atheist. I think that's a fair distinction. I think it's a great way to think about it. And when we think about, moving beyond atheism in that sense, that's what we're talking about.
right.
Just figuring out that we're living in a material world without deities. The other thing we've been using a lot is the nuns, which, David, I don't know how familiar you are with
Yep,
that. I don't
yep.
I don't know. Do you talk to many people who identify as a nun?
I would say that because of the podcast is so specific to deconversion, there are few of them, but I definitely see that as a category. And I would say that many of the members in our community group are what I would call nuns, right? They're spiritual, but not religious. They have,
Mm,
they're somewhere in that category where
mm,
they're done with organized religion for sure. Like that's over with.
mm,
They're not quite naturalists, empiricists, that kind of thing. So
right.
yeah.
And I'm trying to think, Nathan. I don't know if have we talked to anyone who identifies as something other than a humanist. That
Well, I mean, one thing, we talked to Lucian Greaves, who's a Satanist.
that's
Oh,
true.
okay.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah,
uh,
they.
yeah, but
I think they are. They're definitely secular.
I think they
Think
would
they
say they're
identify as.
atheist as well, probably.
hmm
Yeah, they're
I think the
definitely
thing is,
materialist.
yeah, I think so many of these labels, like, there's a lot of overlap, obviously. I mean,
Sure.
they're not, they're definitely not sort of mutually exclusive. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think for me, I always say, I guess if I was pressed to say atheist is the main identifier, just because maybe people know what that means
Mhm.
most of all versus other things. I guess I understand the point of like humanism, where it is focusing on the more positive aspects, or like, positive in the sense of like the actual content of your beliefs rather than what
Right.
you don't believe. But yeah, I guess I mean, I always, maybe there's some sort of thing among atheists about just recoiling at any kind of joining something too closely, and
That's
I
true. Yeah, we're not
you never,
joiners, that's for sure.
yeah, exactly, that's the thing, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with you know everything really that the humanists would stand for. There's always just that reluctance to identify yourself with something too closely or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, part of the project for us is identifying what atheists are, which is not, it doesn't come out. I mean, it's not fully formed, right? We don't
Mhm.
really know what people who are nuns, who are spiritual, who are, who may even still believe in God, but have just left a religion. We don't really know the whole thing. Originally, I think the before the podcast, we had been shopping an article saying that it wasn't basically that atheists, people who were without a religion, were the bloc that sort of pushed the Democrats and Biden over the top.
Mhm.
In late 2020, all of these think pieces came out about very specific groups that were the difference. And our point was like, no, look, if you look at the numbers, base numbers alone, the biggest part now is, or I think it's the pluralist, the largest religious group in the Democrats, or who vote Democrat, are nuns, are
Yeah.
atheists, people with no religion. It's huge, and they vote solidly so, more so than evangelicals vote for Republicans. That's okay. There's something going on here. There's something very, very important. But anytime we tried to tell this story, every rejection was the same. It was always like, no, they're not a block. What you're seeing, this is something different. You're talking about young people who are college educated and live in cities and have white collar jobs, and that doesn't show up in the numbers, right? If it's just that, then you would expect college educated people would vote tremendously this way, urban people would vote tremendously this way. Nuns vote stronger Democrat than urban people do. There's something special that's going on here.
Yeah.
And I mean, exactly what you said, David, like it must be that, there's humanism. It's There has to be something like that going on. It's just not accepted or not evidently clear enough right now.
Yeah. That was one of your first episodes. You were looking at the tendency towards liberalism within the atheist community. And one of the things I was struck by that I'd like to explore here is the atheist community here, and I'll just say like online atheists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tend to say about themselves that there is no atheist community, that there is no atheist culture. And I think your first number of episodes was kind of debunking that in one way or another. So you talked about liberalism. I think I've heard you mention vegetarianism, which is very overrepresented amongst atheists,
Weird.
meditation, hallucinogenics, what have you, right? All of these things are very, very like, over represented by atheists. So I'd like you to talk about what you've explored that are, you would say, are kind of atheist culture.
Well, that first thing, I didn't believe in that, and then I was on Only Sky trying to just trying to talk to people and be like, what would convince you that we are a block and that we are the
Right.
same,
Yeah.
right? And it was the same thing. It's like, oh, it's just correlations. There's no cause. That's just how we are. Well, yeah. Well, what causes us to be that way?
Hmm.
It's a really, really weird thing. Um, yeah. So Nathan, what have we found? Have we answered this question yet?
I mean, I think it seems pretty clear that, yeah, that politically atheists and agnostics and other non-religious people lean kind of left politically. I mean, I don't think that's really even controversial to say. I mean, I think it's, if you look at the nuns as a whole, sort of like everyone who checks the sort of no religion box, it's strong. But then if you look specifically just at atheists, it's even stronger.
Mm.
And I think like the reason why that is, I think there's probably,
We have
well,
pet theories.
yeah, I mean, I think one of them is, well, I'm not, I don't know. I mean, I think that one sort of aspect of atheist politics is sort of like, there is kind of like a rejection kind of certain forms of authority, I suppose, that,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
I think, particularly in, um, issues where, rights, say like abortion or same-sex marriage, things like this, where it's sort of a religious authority who's trying to curtail these rights or whatever. I mean, there's naturally going to be kind of a recoil at this.
Right.
But I'm not sure. I mean, in terms of things like, well, I don't know the numbers, but I imagine there's a similar kind of political view about, increasing social spending, greater, spending on healthcare or something like this. I mean, why atheists should support that? Like, how does that fall from atheism? I don't know exactly. It could be. I mean, it could be something, a kind of a view of, this is the life we have, and so we should, try to help other people to, and maybe it's also. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking on the fly.
Sure. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
something
I'll
about,
speculate with you. It's okay.
yes,
Yeah.
your circumstances are really just random. It's not. There's nothing.
Mm.
There's no kind of divine plan that says, you're rich and therefore you must be looked upon fondly by God, or vice versa, or something like that.
Mhm.
I mean, and maybe there's some like, greater ability to realize that you could, your lot in life is pretty much randomly determined, and you could, just as easily, if you're advantaged, you could have just as easily been disadvantaged, and therefore to try to make things more equitable.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. I mean, yeah.
Right.
I mean, it's also, like to just, there's a danger, I guess, of just like, sort of taking my own views and then kind of extrapolating them
Sure.
to all other atheists.
Yeah.
I guess.
David, like that's the weird thing about this, is I'm sure like you've seen, is that like the road to becoming an atheist is so lonely, right?
Mhm. Yes.
Everybody does it alone. It's always an individual experience. So it seems natural that when you come out of it, you would just be, well, of course, look, it's something you do alone. It's something you do as an individual. Individuals come out there, and we don't understand the reasons why we are certain ways very well. We can't,
Yeah.
if we do, we can't articulate it. So that's why I'm on board with the authority thing. Is that like there's just, if you look at a lot of religion, it's authoritarian. There's a big, Kim Jong Un in the sky. It's a
Yeah. Yes.
totalitarian
Yeah.
system. They're always
Yeah.
watching you. God knows everything. He's in your heart. He's in your mind. He knows when you do things that are wrong. Um, and if he's going to punish the wicked. Now, if you're on
Yeah.
board for that, that sounds great. If you're someone who wants to take orders and do as you're told, that's probably a good train to ride. If you don't like that, if that turns you off, then you're not going to be interested in it. And that's what I suspect. And I'm very happy to promote this theory without any evidence, in the hope that someone will gather evidence and
Yes,
then
that's
prove
right.
this
Exactly.
theory. Yeah.
So that we don't continue to just speculate, I do want to come back to a point that I think is quite profound that you just said, Todd. And I don't want to lose it. And I believe in one of your Medium articles, you talk about this, that the deconversion process tends to be a lonely. You do that
Yeah.
alone. It's a lot in
Yeah.
your head. But in the writing, you mentioned that it's kind of the opposite of a religion or a cult experience, where it's much more about community, or
Yeah.
who you were born, what family you were born with.
Yeah.
And I think that's really a deep insight there, that the rejection of religion is much more of an individualistic part, and maybe that hints at why liberalism is attractive then.
Yeah. It also helps explain why why atheist groups, broadly speaking, kind of wax and wane. Like that sort of having to conform to a group, no matter how mildly, like it's people who have been down that road don't want to go down it anymore. And this is something we've read about and heard from other people. It's tough to keep those groups together. It's tough because a lot of atheists will say they don't believe in anything. So, well, clearly you believe in things. You have a worldview. You have a perspective. You have things that you take as fundamental truths that other truths have to hang on. You accept gravity. But yeah, I think that having to do everything alone, that becomes the place you're most comfortable. And when you have to be in part of a big group and go along with certain perspectives, that's when you become uncomfortable. Yeah. David, I hadn't really thought about that deeply until just now. That's
Yeah. Well, I think we should explore it more. So
yeah. I'm very tempted to credit you with that insight. You gave me credit for it. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to just keep quoting you back to yourselves here. Another thing that you guys were grappling with was, I think, this idea of community. So now you have a secular group, an atheistic group, and as we've just mentioned, we are not joiners.
Yeah.
I believe it was Nathan who talked about the 3 Bs, the belief, belonging, and behavior.
Yeah.
I say it slightly different. I do ABCs, the awe, belonging, and connection. But interesting that, again, Todd, you mentioned that everybody's kind of rediscovering this and redoing this over and over and over again in isolation. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on atheist community and how that is built.
Ooh.
Yeah, easy. This is an easy one. This is a softball.
Well, is it that easy? Wow, gosh. This is one I'm struggling to find a good place to begin with this. Well, do you mean, David, do you mean like, well, okay, here's the thing. One of the things that's really loaded by this is that most organizations, actually almost every organization people are part of, is an atheist organization, right? Like,
right.
Like they're not. If it's not religious, it's just.
Yeah.
But if it's secular, it's not religious. It's atheistic. It ignores. It's that soft atheism we were talking about. It's not this strident, let's go out and destroy all gods. It's this like, it doesn't matter. It's not what we're talking about. It's not what we're worried about. Right. So those organizations already exist, and they. I mean, it would take all day to start to categorize them. With atheist organizing, there's always 2 tracks. And this is something like, from my personal experience, it was exactly what I ran into talking to other people on our podcast. Similar thing. And Evan, who from Atheist United, I think like his experience was the same thing, right? Like where it starts off as the very social thing. You need it. You want to meet people like you. You want to be with people like you, share those stories, share your experiences, and just support one another and be able to do things like make fun of religion every once in a while and not have to smile and nod when people talk about praying for your soul and all that other nonsense. So that social part is usually pretty attractive, but it's limiting, right? People who are serious about atheism and want to promote it, want to push it further, and that's when people start getting alienated, when it becomes more community oriented or political or something like that. That's when you see this that's when they start to fracture based on what we know about how these organizations work. It doesn't mean they all do. I think there were numbers on it. I can't remember. Oh, Nathan, I'm really ill-prepared for this.
Are you thinking of the numbers from the Joseph Blancol's book?
Yeah.
It was something. Yeah.
Is it 2/3?
It was something like. It might have been. This guy named Joseph Blancholm. We interviewed him a few episodes ago. He's a social scientist. That's sufficiently broad. I know he looked at atheist communities, and I think I'm not sure, in late 2000s, and then again 10 years later, say, and there was about the same, like 1,500 um, atheist groups each time he counted. But I think basically, I'm not sure if it was a third or two-thirds that were just, had completely, some of them um, had disappeared, and then sort of new ones
Right.
sprang up in their place.
Right.
Yeah, which, I don't remember the exact numbers, but there was a substantial, sort of turnover, I guess, in these groups.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's for specifically, he's looking at sort of the grassroots atheists getting together
Mhm.
type.
Yeah.
There are, of course, these more established nonprofits that have either like legal goals, like American Atheists is very legalistic, where they're much sturdier. But yeah, David, did that answer the question? I can't remember where it
I mean,
started.
yeah, we're asking an impossible question. It's a question that just constantly gnaws at me. So right now, my podcast, we have a little Facebook group called Deconversion Anonymous that
Mm,
is doing quite well as far as like people supporting one another as they go through
mm,
from the questioning phase to how do I parent as a secular person, or how do I deal
mm,
with my believing spouse? Those kinds of things are the kinds of things
mm,
that come up. But I'm also acutely aware that people, for lack of a better term, age out of it, right? Like they're
yeah,
there for a year and a half or so, and okay, I got what I needed out of this, and I'm going to move on.
yeah.
The thing that I'm interested in is that just being that hyper rationalist and coldly saying, well, you know, religion is wrong. There is no God. Now you're on your own. Good luck
Mm,
is not a compelling argument, is not a compelling thing for normal human beings.
yeah.
And if we actually want, more secularization, more pluralism, we're going to have to do better than that and provide some kind of soft landing for people. And so I'm just constantly asking my guests, like trying to find, kernels of knowledge of how we can accomplish that.
Yeah, I think it's like you said, it's yeah, people may age out of it, and it's like, people may want different things at different times. I mean,
Yes.
sometimes it's just wanting to have a social, like when I've moved to different cities, like, you sort of seek out,
Hmm.
because I think, for a Christian or someone, a natural place to meet new people is at a church or wherever. And I
Sure.
think it was the same for me in a couple of places, where like a natural kind of community, one sort of starting point might be a atheist or secular community. But then, once you're sort of established, maybe you don't need that sort of anymore. But then you might want to be involved in something more political or something like that. You might want to, or is like volunteering in your community or something. I think it is a question, like, is not believing in God, is that enough to bind a community group? I really don't think so. I mean, but I do think, I happened to see this video a few weeks ago or something, and I think, Todd, I told you about it. Like, this guy is talking about the need for third places, meaning
Mm,
places where people hang out. It's not at home, but it's not at work, and there's sort of like some place you just sort of go and hang out. And there's sort of, in this video, is he's just saying, there's been sort of a decline of third places,
yeah.
because community centers, or like, just that things are, it's sense of kind of community centers are kind of hollowed out now, and there's the
Right.
places are now, um, there's some kind of profit motivation, like
Yeah.
at a coffee shop or a bar or something. You can't,
Yeah.
you got to spend money
You
to
got to
hang out
spend money
together.
to be there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually
So I
quite
think,
insightful. And I think you're onto something
yeah.
that's beyond just secular people. That's just
Yes.
Western
Yeah.
culture in
Yes.
general, that
Yes.
we're
Yes.
Yes.
isolated from
Yeah.
one
Yes.
another.
Yes.
And we
Yeah. Yeah.
desperately want community
Hmm.
and connection, and it's
Yeah.
lacking in our
Hmm.
culture.
Whereas,
Hmm.
and this was a big thing, like that third place was huge in Korea, where like the homes are really small. Nobody really hangs out at their home. They
Ah,
do,
okay.
you go from work to another place. And um, and then there's also like, you have different terms for like the first place you go and then the second place you go. And sometimes if the night gets crazy, the third place you go. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's always about these like those outside places. And then coming back, like I mean, cities are rough now in the US, certainly during the pandemic. But then you go out to the suburbs where there's just nothing, right? Like you are in your home, and that's really all there is. That makes it tough. So, and it's like you're saying with Facebook, that's a different experience. It's a different way
Sure.
to meet people. But David, another way we can think about this is that like maybe that these groups come and go is a good thing. Maybe it is the right
Hmm.
thing. What we've seen talking to people, one of the big things that really jumps out at me is that to get plugged into the atheist community, to become part of it, to take over a leadership role, you just have to go and do it. And that's the amazing thing, right? Like they're always looking for volunteers, they're looking for leaders, they're looking for coordinators, whatever it is. You can just go and do it. If there isn't a group, you make a group and people show up, and it's amazing. And maybe, I mean, the way you put it, I think kind of sums it up pretty perfectly, right? If people age out, it means like they're moving on to something else, and that's really
Mm.
good. And
Yeah, that's actually can be very healthy. Yeah.
yeah, that it might be for the best. It might be what we need to do. Atheism is not at a place where we can answer that definitively now.
Hmm.
But we recently talked to the head of recovery from religion, which
Yes.
walks people through the deconversion process, offers a lot of peer support, meaning people who've been through it.
Hmm.
And fortunately, like that one is pretty sturdy. It seems really, really set. It's not fly by night operation. It's professionalized. Um, but like that's what they do, right? There's no one who should be be going to that forever, right? You should do it
Right.
until you
Yes.
rebuild your social capital, you meet people, you readjust to the world, and you go on to something else. So in the long term, David, maybe having these groups where people are forced to create them, build them, and dissolve them is the way it should be, right? That sort of creative process might be the healthiest thing for atheists. It might be what atheism really, really needs, compared to those institutions that just stick around forever and outlive their usefulness and just like and I mean we there are a lot of this sort of institutional legacy where an institution is built to meet a specific need. That need may or may not go away, but then it needs to sustain itself. And
Hmm.
it's just the institution needs to start taking in money, regardless of what it actually offers. So that's the alternative view to it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
But
think that's
really,
interesting insight as well. Yeah.
yeah, and really, but where we are right now, we don't have any idea of what it's going it's going to look like. It's not predetermined. The future is unwritten. This is the good thing. We get to do it now. And that's beyond atheism, right? How are we doing it?
Yeah. I guess just to sort of add on, I think there's also the problem though is that there's a problem of like uh, people having to kind of reinvent the wheel constantly if there's not if groups are constantly dissolving.
Hmm.
And again, I mean, maybe that's not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, it's in the same way that everyone kind of goes through the deconversion process, and it's going to look different from everyone, but it's um, yeah, but nonetheless, it's sort of a journey. Everyone, well, not everyone has to go, but some people do. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I don't, yeah, yeah, I guess that's the point of how to kind of keep up that institutional legacy, so
Mm,
that people who are going through it, that it is there for them or something.
yeah. And there are people who are great at it and do it again and
Hmm.
again. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the takeaway from this conversation is to say that there's nothing special about starting a group. You could just, go on meetup.com, say, hey, I'm going to be at this location this time. We're going to talk
yeah,
about
Hmm.
deconversion. We're going to talk
it's
about
funny.
atheism, what have you. And people just show up
Yeah.
and just do it is the
Although,
thing.
yeah, I mean, a follow up to it, the thing that we were starting to find is that the same names keep coming up, right? There are um, the sort of network effects that are happening.
Hmm.
And because it's, you opt into this stuff, people who do it the most, do it the best, are they're moving their way to the top, and they're connecting with other people who've done it.
Hmm.
So we're starting to see sort of big national groups having connections with smaller local groups, and that seems much more stable. Um, these sort of network effects, they're growing, and again, we don't know where it's going to go, but like we did it with, I think it was it Chris Cameron? Who did we get the survey from? As you can tell, I'm not very detail oriented. I do not have good memory. But basically, there was one group who they were like, "Oh yeah, we started vetting all the local politicians.
Yeah.
Just sent out a survey, and when they send it back, we give it a score and we tell everybody in the group what the score was.
Right.
And then we started getting requests for the survey, right, from other groups who want to do the same thing. That part is building, right? That seems, so we have these two things, right? We have these transitory groups, people come and go, they're looking for connections, rebuilding social capital. Then you have these long-term institutional organizations that are more stable and sticking around, and they're learning and they're building on it. So like that survey is going to go around and around and around. It's going to become a set thing. Everybody's going to know about it, and you just change the name of the state or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're seeing some of these effects, but on the most immediate personal level, it's still just drop a, go to meetup.
One last topic, and I may rearrange this thematically. So I understand, Nathan, that you've written about and some of your expertise is about racism. And
Mm.
I'm interested to know like the intersection between racism and atheism. I know I've had lots of our Black friends on who've said they're a minority of a minority and have not necessarily been accepted with wide open arms. But how we address that within the secular atheist community, how we can make sure that we are welcoming to everybody.
Yeah.
No pressure, no pressure. Just
yeah.
solve the.
I mean, yeah, I guess I researched the topic sort of historically, and so I wrote a book. Everyone should check it out.
Yes.
It's
Please
called
plug it. Yeah, go ahead and plug the book.
Race in a Godless World, Atheism, Race, and Civilization, 1850 to 1914. Kind of a long title. Basically, well, maybe I'll just say something about the book and then say if
Sure.
it has some relevance to the present. Basically, the argument was, well, I think that the sort of starting point is in the 19th century, which is what I was looking at. It was the vast majority of atheists were white, and so I was really looking at what are the attitudes of white people about race and racism, and what I found is that there were, as you might expect in the 19th century, people they did accept these ideas of racism and white supremacy and so on. But I also found that in other ways there were these white atheists who were far ahead of their time, I would say, with regard to race and questioning things like slavery and imperialism and even sort of the underlying logic of racism, that there was sort of a biological hierarchy of races or something like that. Which is not, it's quite a radical position in the 19th century. So I guess the theme of the book was sort of just getting at this complexity. I think as it stands now, I mean, I really, I don't know if I have too much to add other than what you said, that I think, atheists of color, and I should add, for list, since it's just audio, I'm
Sure.
a white guy, so I mean,
yeah,
it's a little bit weird, but
I put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
no, but no, I mean, I understand, that atheists of color have sort of unique needs, we'll say, within the community, and I think we've talked with Mandisa Thomas, for example, who started Black Nonbelievers.
Yeah.
And I think because there's sort of a unique, atheists. Atheists share sort of this, coming out or deconverting and so on. But I think Black atheists, for example, maybe have particular things in common that perhaps white people or other people just really can't maybe relate to as much.
Right.
So I think having spaces for that, I think is a good thing. Yeah.
All right, I'll let you off the hot seat.
But David, the other thing is we're old atheists now is another thing. We kind of lose.
Well, I certainly am. I'm the gray beard here, so yes.
And generationally things are changing. It's tough to keep track of the youth, but they have very different perspectives, and I think the numbers are changing too, which is a good thing, right?
Yes.
That's great. We did also recently learn that among the sort of Black atheist lineage of thought, right? Like if you take this intellectual family tree, it goes back to Thomas Paine, which was a wake up, because it's like, wait a minute, that's like every time we start tracing it back in the UK, even in the US, where this line of thought back to Robert Ingersoll goes back to Thomas Paine. So it's amazing that like intellectually there's this incredible overlap. It's completely related. There's not really a difference. The cultural overlap isn't there yet, but it's generationally, and as like more atheists get together, like it's something we're going to have to do. And of course, since we seem to be so related to humanism, the interest is there. Like it's not just that, in the past we might be able to say atheists are right about exactly one thing: there's no God. Now it seems if we are expanding this to like, well, we're all materialists, right? We're all humanists. We all think we should have a secular government. It's time, put it into action.
Yeah. Oh, can I add one more thing on the race thing? Just sort of what Todd was saying a little earlier, just about it's true that I think right now white atheists are kind of disproportionately white, but I think when you look at sort of the younger generations, it's the case that more it's atheists as a sort of group are becoming more diverse, I suppose. When you look at kind of the Gen Z, as we would say in Canada,
as a Canadian would say, yes.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's growing more. I mean, I guess atheists are going to just look more like the population as a whole, I suppose.
Yeah. The Canadian thing and the vegan thing is weird. That's one that keeps surprising, especially since I stopped eating meat and dairy. That's I don't. David, do you eat meat?
I unfortunately do. Yes.
Even that, why? Unfortunately.
I feel like I'm way out of the atheist culture by still eating meat. But yeah.
But it's a weird one. I don't think there is is there an atheist culture that says you can't eat meat?
No, I think
that runs
for
together,
sure.
right?
No, but I think that we take a rationalist approach to morality. We think about consciousness and sentience, and that we see how that expands to the animal kingdom. And I mean, there are some moral obligations there. I will admit that the factory farming is horrendous, and I know that, and I just basically go blah 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 blah.
Yes, yeah.
So that is not a terribly ethical stance. So
yeah, but see, what you've just explored, is something that's not. It's not coincidental, right? That it comes up. Yeah. It's part of the atheist experience where you're critically thinking about all these things. You're using these tools, and you've taken in these values as part of it. It's a really remarkable thing that we're all, we're kind of discovering ourselves, that we all have these commonalities.
Yeah, for sure. I think just to wrap this up here, one of the things I find interesting about the commonalities amongst religious traditions. So obviously there's lots of diversity, but there's also lots of commonalities. And I think one argument is to say that you take the supernatural elements out and the very specific cultural elements out, and you wind up with humanism. That is the commonality, but also that it is the commonalities are there because human beings, we are the operating system, as it were. We're the same no matter where we are, and we're going to come to some very similar conclusions. And so, I think you've tapped into that, Todd, that, as we explore a rational approach to morality and we're trying to be consistent within our morality, we're going to come to some very common conclusions. And it's because we're human beings. That's the common denominator.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that, I mean, I think I think there's more variety than that, David. And I
Sure.
think rationality is a lot more flexible and fluid than we think. But yeah, when you take the time to think these things out, it's remarkable that we all come to similar conclusions, right? Just by giving it a good think. Yeah.
And just to be clear, I don't mean that we will all come to happy harmony and agreement. I think that's why I'm a pluralist. That's why I'm a secularist, is that I want the marketplace of ideas to be in competition with one another to find the truth, closer approximations to the truth.
I mean, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about your being graceful, right? Like, it's not, us too, we're not out to abolish religion. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that, particularly for what we're doing. The thing that kind of, especially where the battle lines have been drawn these days, where we're seeing real political struggle, it's not that we need to go out and destroy religion and make sure it never impacts humanity this way again.
Right.
We're saying, just leave us alone, right? Don't impose it upon us, because we have no interest in imposing upon other people. We've never talked to any atheist who said, we need to force these people to renounce their beliefs. It never, ever comes up.
Yeah, I would hope that most of us are not totalitarians. And that, I truly do believe in freedom of religion and freedom from religion. And it's that last bit that we've been lacking.
Yeah.
And that we do, in some senses, need to fight for on the political stage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. The podcast is Beyond Atheism. This has been Nathan Alexander and Todd Tavares. Can you tell people how to get in touch with you, how to find the podcast, any other work you want to plug?
Oh, well, we're on the Atheist United network now, so you can find it through their website. Any problem you have, any complaints, go on Twitter. It's Nath G. Alexander. We'll get them. We'll look them over. Yeah. I think that's it. I don't...
All right.
David, I've been such a hermit lately. It's ridiculous. It's really, I spend all this time talking about and reading about and talking to other people about atheist organizing. And man, I'm not even online. I don't even have an online presence. It's crazy.
That's awesome. That's probably better for your mental health. So.
Yes.
Nathan, last word, anything?
Yeah, just find me on Twitter, like Todd said. And check out my book if people are interested.
Yeah, one more time, the title of the book?
Raised in a Godless World.
Fantastic. We will have links to those things in the show notes. Gentlemen, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Final thoughts on the episode. I think you can see that Nathan and Todd have a very similar approach to what we've got going on here at the Graceful Atheist podcast. Beyond Atheism is asking the question that I was asking shortly after my deconversion: now what? As I mentioned in the conversation, I had read all the books, all the Four Horsemen, and was immediately aware of the fact that I was just rereading things I already agreed with. And I was much more interested in what do we do now? And that is the topic that Nathan and Todd are tackling in the Beyond Atheism podcast. I very highly recommend that you check them out. There were a number of things that came up in the conversation that I think are deep and insightful. Todd talked about recognizing early on in their secular communities in South Korea that there was a difference between the community of those who were raised with religion and those who were not. I think that is the difference that we are trying to describe here on this podcast. It is a radically different experience to be an atheist from the age of reason on and maybe have only a lightweight religious training versus being steeped in a fundamentalist experience as a child and then coming out of that as an adult. The other thing that I thought was super deep that we got to was the fact that the conversion experience, the experience of becoming a believer and a part of a community, is a community event. It's driven by your family, if you grew up in it. It's driven by a church, or a general rule, it's person to person. Literally, all of Christianity is about evangelism. It's about, to give it its best spin, it is about loving people out of hell. To give it its worst spin, it is manipulating the people that you have connections with. And yet, deconversion, deconstruction, is a completely isolated, solitary, and alone experience. Almost every one of us who has gone through this alone. Very, very few of us have a partner in crime, so to speak, going through the deconstruction process at the same time. The last people we are able to talk about it with are the believers in our lives. I find that to be a profound insight of what it takes to go through this process. The guts that it takes, the courage, the willingness to face truth even when it hurts deeply, the willingness to risk community and friendships and even potentially family. It is an amazing, amazing journey that you all have taken. I also thought Nathan's insight referring to this concept of third places, community locations, and how they are missing within Western culture was also deeply insightful. The first two places are home and work, but these third places where you're out in the community, being a part of the community, are very, very difficult to find. And I think that is what we've been talking about a lot here on this podcast as well. We're trying to build online community, but there's a desperate need, a desperate desire for people to connect with each other, to be in the same room with one another, to be able to spend time with each other. And I do hope that over the following years that we're able to make that leap from online to in person. And then finally, the insight that because secular people tend not to be joiners, and we continue to kind of recreate these communities over and over again without any reference to previous attempts, there is an upside to this in that it remains fresh. As I said, people will age out of listening to this podcast, and people may age out of these communities. But having that refresh process taking place constantly means that they are not stuck in tradition and making the same mistakes that fundamentalist religion has made. It allows it to be contemporary and in the moment, the zeitgeist of the thinking of that day. Still, I think we do need to connect with each other, and that should be a goal for people who are in the middle of deconstruction or on the other side of deconversion. I'll plug here Nathan Alexander's book, Race in a Godless World, Atheism, Race, and Civilization, 1850 to 1914. That's going to be a bit more of a scholarly piece of work, but I think it would be very interesting to go and check that out as well. The podcast is Beyond Atheism. You can find that on all the major platforms. I want to thank my guests, Nathan Alexander and Todd Tavares, for joining me here and for the work that they do, bringing us beyond atheism. Thank you both. The secular grace thought of the week is, you are not alone. The deep insight of this conversation is that you convert in community and you deconvert alone. I have been saying that over the years, but I've never been able to put it in quite that succinct and pithy a way. I think this is helpful to understand the feeling of loneliness, the feeling of isolation, the feeling of the uniqueness of your experience. When I think back on my deconversion and the years leading up to it, which really was a deconstruction, but without me knowing that word, and I'll say here that most people who are questioning have no idea what the word deconstruction is, or at least haven't until recently, until it's become widely known. It feels like you are the only one, that there couldn't possibly be any other people who are doubting the way that you are. I know that I felt that way. And the message of this podcast is that not only is that not the case, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are questioning, doubting, deconstructing, and deconverting. But also the reference to Jennifer Michael Hecht's book, Doubt: A History, that this has been so for as long as there have been believers. I find that deeply and profoundly comforting, that we are not unique, that this is a process that human beings have been going through for time immemorial. The important part for you to know as you question and face your own cognitive biases, as you wrestle with the cognitive dissonance that can feel like a wrestling match with yourself, that this isolated feeling isn't actually true, that there are so many out there going through the same process. The community that we are trying to build at Deconversion Anonymous is a safe place to question, to doubt, to deconstruct, and deconvert. Please consider joining, and you will know instantly that you are not alone. That's at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. All right, we've got a lot of exciting interviews coming up. We've got a couple from Arlene. In fact, Arlene's going to feature throughout the rest of November and December. Arlene has 2 interviews, one with a couple, Ben and Ange, and one with Nikki Pappas. We have Jessica Moore, who is focused on recovering from purity culture. Again, we had to redo her interview, but that's been done. That'll be coming up. And then for December, late December, we have 2 conversations between Arlene and myself. I interview Arlene and talk about what she's learned from the community management of Deconversion Anonymous and doing these interviews. And then we turn the tables and she interviews me. For those of you who are longtime listeners, it might be a bit repetitive. For those of you who have just joined in the last year and a half or so, it might be brand new information. So I'm excited for you to hear my thoughts on secular grace and deconversion and the process of doubting. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.